Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Experimentation with A/B Testing is Easier Than You Think. This event is brought to you in partnership with our friends at Split. Thank you so much for joining us on the webinar today. This is going to be a really fascinating event. Before we get started, there's just a few things that you should know about today's webinar. First off, I should mention my name is David Davis, and I'll be serving as the host and moderator for the event today. As always, we want these events at Actual Tech Media to be educational. We know how tough it can be out there in the world of technology, and we want to help you to solve your challenges that you're facing in your organization. And so we encourage questions. I see many of you have already said hello and greetings and salutations from across the United States and around the world, but we also want your technical questions related to today's topic. So as you're watching the live demos and looking at the presentation from today, on today's event, if you have a question, just drop it right there in the questions box, and we'll be answering those questions live at the end of the event. So keep those questions coming. We also have a best question prize to help further encourage those questions. Maybe you have something on your mind, not quite sure if you should ask it. Well, we've got a prize to help kind of encourage those questions or shake them loose. Before we talk about those, I do want to call your attention there to the handouts tab. It's there that you'll find a number of resources related to today's topic. The first one, and probably the most important, being the option to book a demo with Split to learn about their innovative testing solution. You can do that right there in the handouts tab. There are also resources there on why experiment at all with A/B testing, as well as looks like an interview with our expert presenter today and simulated bootstrap A/B testing resources there. So make sure that you check those out. Lots of great resources today in the handouts tab. And then at the end of the live presentation, I'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card prize. If you're watching this on demand, of course, that drawing would have already occurred. The prize terms and conditions can be found there in the handouts tab. And then, as I mentioned, we also have our best question prize. This is for an additional gift card, an Amazon $50 gift card, which means you have to ask a question to be entered into that drawing and meet the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions. All right, so with our housekeeping information out of the way, I'm excited now to bring in and welcome today's expert presenter. Welcome to Bertil Hatt, experimentation advocate at Split. Hey, Bertil, it's great to have you on.
Hey, David. Very, very happy to be on. How are things?
Excellent, excellent. This is a fascinating topic. I'm really interested to hear your presentation today, so take it away.
Absolutely. So first introduction, my name is Bertil Hatt. I'm an experimentation advocate at Split, which means that I'm not going to try to tell you use Split at any cost. I'm actually not going to demonstrate the product myself today. I would love you to do that, but my role is to tell you you should experiment. You should run A/B test, and here's ways of running that. And that's very much the point of my presentation today. I want to talk about a very simple topic, something that I've heard a lot, which is why not just run before and after changes? All of you are technical leaders. All of you have seen problems, found solutions to those problems, and your instinct is very naturally, there was a problem, I fixed it, and if I look before I fix it and after I fix it, there's a massive difference, therefore I fix something that's good. And in some cases, if you have bugs, if you have massive issues, outages, you definitely want to do it that way. But for many problems that are a bit more subtle, I would recommend not to do it that way. I know that can seem counterintuitive. I would recommend, if you're trying to fix this a bit more behavioral, a bit more subtle, a bit more about user experience, I would strongly recommend that you run A/B test. The point of my presentation today is both to explain what's the idea of an A/B test, show the limits it has, but very intentionally not use statistics. One of the biggest concerns I see when I see people presenting A/B test is they jump immediately into Greek letters and things like that. And I'm aggressively not trying to do anything like that. I'm trying to show you how you can understand an A/B test with a very simple Excel queries, something that anyone should be able to understand, because I'm not trying to use anything magical. And possibly, if you have a bit more time, go into a bit more nuance around what makes A/B test difficult and what you should think about if you have more than just one A/B test at a time. What I really want to do is I want to convince you that A/B tests are not necessarily the best approach. A/B tests are the best approach when you're trying to run something. And I want you to understand that these are not a miracle thing you have to hand over to a statistician. This is something where you can understand the nuance, understand the difficulty, on your own without having to ask anyone to explain to you complicated things about t-test and normal distributions and anything like that. Why do I think that A/B testing, why controlling experiments is so important? Why don't just look at what happened and drive information from there? There's a lot of examples. The first link in the resource lists a lot of stories, mostly around ancient medicine. And that is something that you want to, like, we have run the process that way for centuries, and that's how medicine was stored for centuries. Why? Because someone was sick and you blow some steam at them, you had them eat something suspicious. Most of the time they died, but whoever survived felt a lot better the day after. And that was good enough. People thought that would work and never really tried to understand what were they trying to do make sense. And thankfully, we've moved on from that for the most part. That has hidden a lot of key properties. Sometimes people felt better because they would feel better the next day without any kind of treatment. But because we're not running A/B tests, because we're trying what happens if we give them treatment versus if we don't, let's take 1,000 people, split them in half and see able to understand the impact it had. And as soon as we started in the 18th century, we had a lot of controversies, a lot of people very angry because things that they spent their entire life studying wasn't actually working. And that was absolutely essential. That kind of bias of let's not run an A/B test, but look at who survives and ask them what they think happened is survivor bias. And it is absolutely omnipresent. I'm just a victim of it. I should have been in the US. I'm not able to because I had COVID. What I'm going to do just in front of you, I'm going to take a drug that I usually take when I have the flu. This probably doesn't work for COVID, but I feel a lot better when I have it when the flu. The doctors don't know if it works, but it makes me feel better. That's not rational. That makes me feel better. I know it's not going to hurt me too much because I've been taking it for most of my life, but that is an example of something where science doesn't know. And we all feel a lot better, myself included, if we know that actually science knew that was working. And there's been a lot of effort in the last 2 years trying to understand those processes around COVID, but even then it's not enough. And this is a very old phenomenon. During World War II, there's a very classic example of people trying to figure out where were planes getting shot and where they need armor. And when they saw, they look at the planes, they look at the bullets that are happening, and when they saw where the bullets were happening, it didn't really make sense because it seems that the planes coming back had bullets in places that were not that important. Thankfully, there was a statistician working there, Dr. Wald, and he was able to explain that the reason why they saw that was because the plane who had holes elsewhere were not able to come back. And this idea of you should not look at what's happening, but you should understand if you have a selection into your observation is absolutely essential. One example that is absolutely omnipresent is this move to digital. A lot of people have seen really successful company have a website, sell online, and everybody's like, this is the future. And that makes a lot of sense. But the way you look at it is not necessarily the best way. Because if a company is profitable, they have budget that they can spend on moving to digital. It might not be because they move to digital that they get some money. And this idea of am I observing whatever the survivors did, or am I actually testing it properly, is absolutely essential when you're trying to understand a phenomenon. And this is not just something that has to be true in medicine. It's something that is really true in every aspect of life, including business. And it's still, for many things that people believe, people feel strongly about, this is still something that you want to, check accordingly. So there's a lot of examples where there may or may not be a survivor bias. I'd love to get your feedback. I'd love to have a bit more interaction with you around which one do you think are examples of where we believe what we did because we're only listening to survivors, not everybody. Classic example is giving money to people in developing countries. Is that something that we don't do the countries that we're giving money to? What happens if you jump without a parachute? Is that an example of something where only you listen to the survivors? An example that is, I think, quite self-critical is a lot of companies do A/B test. Is it because, just like for moving to the digital transformation, is an example of where A/B testing is a peacock effect, or is it something that actually influences them meaningfully? And the classic example is if you have intersections with red lights, changing that red light into a roundabout, is that actually saving lives, or is it something that has to do with a survivor bias? I'm looking at the results in front of me, moving quite fast. Thank you so much for all the fast response. There's a bit of answer for everybody. Let me just share those with you. So giving money to people in developing countries, that is a very good example of something where until quite recently, people just thought that was helpful, but never actually proved it. And the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago in 2019 was given to a team of three economists, Abid Banjari, Estelle Duflo, and Michael Kremer, because precisely they were like, we cannot do something as important as helping developing countries without that kind of test. And they did something incredibly controversial. They gave money to some villagers and not others to see if the money they were giving was valuable and to see how giving money, what were the conditions, what were the amounts, what were the rhythm around that. And that helped them make tremendous progress into that aspect. So giving money to people in developing countries is something that thankfully for the last few decades hasn't been suffering from survivor bias, but this is something that was very controversial at the time and needed to get the Nobel Prize for people to understand the value it has in it. A lot of you have answered that parachutes prevent people from dying from a high fall. It is weirdly enough that is an example of survivor bias. We have not A/B tested that for obvious ethical reasons. That is a good example of a situation where you want to understand what's happening before you run an A/B test, because running one of the two arms of the A/B test might be highly unethical. In this case, some people have tried to jump without parachutes, and we know what happens. And that is why A/B tests should work in many cases, should work when both options make sense. In that case, one of the other two options doesn't make sense, and you're better off trusting your instinct. But different ways of folding parachutes, different ways of size of the parachutes, all these have been heavily tested. It's just not using one is something that we shouldn't do one. What about technology companies and A/B test? That is a very, very good point. As far as I can tell, and this is something I'm actively looking into, I do not believe that someone has tried to pick a set of companies and say, you run an A/B test, you don't, and see what's the difference in terms of growth, in terms of understanding between those two companies. And so I am advocating for A/B testing without the argument that this is something that we have A/B tested. It's a bit self-serving. It's a bit of a meta problem. But it's absolutely something I'm conscious and something that I think the industry in general should try to understand a bit better. What about roundabouts? Roundabouts are a classic example of not just survivor bias, but another problem that is convergence to the mean. I'll try to go through that a bit later, but that's just an example of something that I want to be mindful of. Why do I believe that a before and after test isn't necessarily working? The most obvious, the most common case, is the one you see on the graph to the side, is what if your company has significant growth? What if you're looking at how many people have a high conversion rate, and a lot of them are shifting to mobile? So you have an increasingly high conversion rate per session because most of the sessions are on mobile. What about certain effects are moving because you move from having hundreds of very committed developers, of very committed users, to thousands, even millions of users that know a bit less about your brand. You have an overall trend in your business. And if you're trying to test things on that trend, what you will notice is that your average before a change and after a change are quite a big difference, not because the change you're impacting is actually meaningful, but because you're just measuring a change in the trend in general. Same thing for seasonality. Travel is a business I've worked a bit in, and there's a lot of situation where if you test something, what happens in March and then what happens in April, you'll see completely different activity, but that's because people book holidays in April, not in March. Same thing if you're doing tax planning at roughly the same time. And any kind of observation is going to be dependent on any kind of noise. Weather changes, copycats are changing, all those things mean that if you're trying to look before and after, you're going to have a lot of effects that are not helping you meaningfully. One example of a problem a bit like that, but slightly more subtle, is the convergence to the mean. I won't necessarily go into detail here, but that is an example where if you don't run an A/B test properly, you will have an effect that is not the reality of what's happening. So the key thing I want you to know about this, the thing I want you to retain is, don't believe that by looking before and after, you're measuring the effect of the change you did in the meantime. Anything else happening at the same time can happen at the same time. So change and just looking at the impact is just not enough for what you're trying to do. What about actually running a test and comparing two countries? That can come with a lot of issues. I've went through a very complicated situation once when I was working for a video game company. It was a casual video game, and we're constantly trying to make the game a bit more fun, a bit more playful. And like every single game, it was play tested first in New Zealand. I'm not entirely sure why New Zealand. I think it's because they're quite isolated and speak English. But the game was doing okay, but not good enough. And then we wanted to test it into Canada. The way we tell if a video game like that is good enough is something called day one retention. People install the game, play it for a bit. You have a fairly long, like hour-long session for like discovering the game, making sense. And we're wondering, are they coming back the next day? Typically, people play after work, so 6, 7, 8, 9 p.m. And they play. If they play really well, they might play until midnight. But typically, are they coming back midnight and the day after? But the way we measured retention was not based on midnight in New Zealand. It was based on midnight UTC because of the reporting system we had at the time. And that means that when we started having the same players with the same behavior test the game in Canada, midnight UTC was the middle of the night, or the middle of the evening for them. And so we had a much higher day one retention. But that's because, not that we're coming back the day after, but that's because they were playing at 8 p.m. and they were continuing playing for an hour. And at 9 p.m., those people were considered day one retained. And so that one metric shot up because we were not using time zones properly. That sounds like a ridiculous edge case, and it absolutely is. But issues like that mean that if you're trying to compare between two countries with very different contexts, you can have some really obscure things happening, as much as people average salary, people's disposable income, local customs, religion, anything can come into play that will affect your test. That is not whether or not the version we showed to New Zealand and the version with 2 weeks of work that we then showed to Canada, we couldn't tell if that was meaningful or different. Those comparisons, even if you're trying as much as you can to make them fair, are not fair if you have to introduce any kind of artificial effect. I'm actually curious, if you were working for a company like that, if you're trying to test a video game, what would you have done? Would you have tried to fix the metric so that you could take into account local effects? Would you have run the test in more than just two countries, like US, UK, Ireland, other English-speaking countries? Would you have tried to run it in 20 different countries? Something that we know as a quasi-experiment. Or would you have run A/B tests of different versions of the game? I'm seeing a lot more people responding. That's actually quite exciting. I give you an extra minute to go through the answers, but there's a clear trend. I'm not seeing any more response, so I'm going to move on to the results. Very few of you have said fix the metric to match the local sleeping habits. That could have made sense. That would have been a good way of addressing it. But there's a lot more problems that we'd have come across, especially actually identifying sleeping habits in those countries. There's just no documented database on when people go to bed, when it's too late to go. Like those day-to-day habits are actually not well documented. Canada's a really big place. It has multiple time zones. All these things have made that exercise a bit more difficult. We could have run the test in more countries, either 1 to 3 more countries, or just translated the game into enough languages to be able to test in 20 different countries, but that would have been quite difficult. And actually, you end up with a very significant effort around, are those countries rich enough for people to have the latest version of the iPhone? How expensive is the internet access? Are there lag? And all those changes mean that if you actually want to make a comparison that is fair, you need to do what is known as synthetic control, which is like you're trying to reproduce what would New Zealand be like given the data we have about Canada and the difference we know about them. And that is a ton of work. So I'm not saying those first 3 answers are impossible, but they require a lot more work to have accurate answers. And this is something that is far more difficult than actually doing a proper randomized test, especially if you have tools like Split. So my recommendation would be, like in agreement with most of you, actually run an A/B test and try to have different versions of the game in every country. But one of the issues we had at the time is Apple, who was the platform for that game, wasn't a big fan of having A/B testing on the game. They thought that was just make different experiments for different users. And that made implementing an A/B test quite difficult at the time because Split didn't exist at the time. Having a platform that helps you have slightly different versions of the games that you can test which one makes the most sense is absolutely transformational and something I strongly recommend you to think about if you've been thinking about A/B testing and haven't been able to do it properly lately. So what's the idea of an A/B test? Quite simply, take the experience, split people into as much as you can, and see if there's any meaningful difference between the two. But what you come across with that definition is you have, what do you mean meaningful difference? That's where the idea of an AA test is really instructive. And what I want to walk you through today is this idea that if you don't do an A/B test, if you do a test without doing a change, what is known as an AA test, you can actually understand what an A/B test is capable of doing. Let's take a simple example. You have an e-commerce, you have people coming in, some of them convert, or you're handling backend services and sometimes some of them fail and you want to know about it. What does that actually look like in practice? Let me share my screen. And so you're probably going to have something along the lines of different sessions outside a different time, user IDs that should look anonymized enough, and some of them convert, some of them don't. That, in light gray, those 3 first columns, is something that presumably you have in your database at the moment. You have not exposed any of them to a different treatment. These are all identical in terms of what they've seen on the website, as far as you can tell. What you can have, I don't know if you can see my the tab in that, is you randomize them between control and treatments artificially. And because the way Excel especially work, anytime you type anything, the randomization changes between the 2 things. This I've put into a pivot table so that you have totals. And you see I have 1,000 users. Half of them are in control, half of them are in treatment, and roughly 30% of each are in have an event and conversion rate or not. All of those have been treatment and control are people that have seen the same thing. We just artificially put them into two baskets just for the sake of it. And so we have a conversion rate for control and a conversion rate for treatment that is fake treatment, that is not an actual treatment. And we can compare the two with this simple formula to see one minus the other divided by the control. That is different than the measuring when you should not be measuring anything. That should be zero. It's actually really close to zero, so that's kind of reassuring. What if I took that value and I pasted it? Sorry. No, I pasted it there. What you've noticed is that every time I touch anything on that screen, the numbers change. The reason the numbers change is because these segments change. So I can actually, I've implemented a script to do the copy automatically. Like anytime I click that script, I actually get a new version of this split. And every time I run the split, I have different attribution for control, different attribution for treatment. And so those have just changed a little bit. What does that mean in practice? That means that I'm not changing anything and I might see a difference by accident. But how much is that accident? And it can be quite small. You've seen examples that are very close to zero, 0.6 here is very close to zero. You've seen examples where randomly, on a small sample of 1,000 users, by accident, we see actually really big difference of 15, 20, I've seen the 20 here difference. This is absolutely massive. And that's something that you probably want to be mindful of. If you actually look at, I've actually run it before 100 times. If you look at how much does that mean if you try to run it, I believe I've run it, 300 times roughly. This is what the distribution looks like. So far, I've taken past data, whether people have converted. I have assigned them to control and treatment artificially without changing what the experiments they have. And I've said, okay, I know there's no difference. Do I see a difference? And in many, many cases, you see here between 3% or 5% difference in the middle, but some people see up to 15% difference, 12% difference here. So you see this is actually very noisy measurements. And so if I see a difference between control and treatment of 12% when I'm trying to change something, this tells me, well, that could happen even if what you change didn't have any kind of impact. When you hear about statistics, t-test, standard deviation, this is what people actually have in mind. This is, I know that you're trying to split fairly, and as far as I can tell, the split was roughly fair, but that split might actually not be, that split might not necessarily fair enough for you to have that kind of impact. And when you hear this 5% difference, this is actually what you see on this graph. What you say, the way the statistical tests work is, we know what happens if you run a test without any kind of difference. This looks like that. We're going to decide that anything in the middle is not enough difference to be meaningful. And we're going to decide that the 5% on one end or the 5% on the other end are outliers. They are far enough from what our expectation would be if there were no difference, that if I see those, I'm going to consider that this is a meaningful, a statistically significant difference. The 5% is among those little blue squares you see on my screen. You take 5% on one end, you take 5% on the other end, and these are the one that you exclude. In that case, that's probably going to be minus 15 here, down to minus 24 here, if I count properly. That's what the 5% mean. So the 5% are not how many of my results are actually good, how many of my results are actually bad, if the test is significant, is the 5% means if I have no difference, how many times I'm going to see something and say, oh, that looks like there's a difference when we know there's no difference. How many times do I get where I say there's like a positive difference, but that difference isn't real? Hence the name false positive rate. That's all that we're actually trying to do. That's the key intuition that we're trying to do. So what if you actually try to change something? then the change that you do has to be an outlier. It has to go far enough from the expectation that you actually measure it. And if you test like I just did on 1,000 users, that is going to be a really noisy, a really broad outlier. Any change that is not at least 15, 20% change is probably going to fall in the middle, and it's probably going to say that's not big enough for you to make a difference. One common expression that you'll hear a lot, because you see you have a change that is positive in direction that you business you want, and in a direction that is not what the business want. That's not what we mean by positive and negative. Positive and negative. Negative means there's no detectable effect, so it's in the bulb in the middle. The change you do is not big enough that we can actually tell it apart from randomness. Positive means the change is detected. It is high enough in the right direction to make sense. Another word that you'll hear a lot when you talk about tests is two-tail versus one-tail tests. That means, do you consider only the direction that you care about, only the condition that is favorable for the business? So in the case of failures, that is fewer failures, or in the case of conversion, that is more conversion. Or do you consider the change in the direction of both changes as being significant? Are you trying to measure a difference in either direction? That is two-tail versus one-tail. You have a lot of debate between people who practice experimentation around which one is the most valuable. My take is it's up to you into what you're trying to prove. That is an important question to have, but there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. But what is key is when we talk about statistically significant, what we mean is the change you saw is more impactful than most random noise. And by most, we mean 95%, the way that you asked to set in a lot of the system. What does that mean for the limits of an A/B test? The key thing is the power analysis. One example of, let me just show you what power analysis looks like. One example of something that you might want to do is you might want to have more users. So this is roughly the same users, but rather than have just 1,000, I have 4,000, and I use the same kind of randomness between the two. And this is a pivot that runs exactly the same way between the two. As you can see, the numbers are a lot closer. And if we have 5,000 users, then you have the same shape, which is this roughly bell curve that you hear so much. The reason people are so fascinated by the bell curve is that if you run that test thousands of times, thousands of times, you're going to end up with that curve looking like a bell curve. It doesn't really look like it. It's a bit of a knack at the moment, but it's getting close. And if rather than run the experiment on 1,000 users, you run the experiment on 4,000 users, rather than have this big broad thing that goes as far as 15, 20% difference, you start seeing some values up closer. And in this case, if you exclude the 5% on each end, you will see any change that is more than 3% either way is something that you might be able to detect. That is why when you hear people running tests, you say your test is okay, well, we need to run it for longer. It's not because people necessarily want a test to be slow or longer. It's because they want to have more users. Because if they have more users, you have the ability, your test has the ability to be a bit more specific. That's what we're trying to use with this simulation. That is why running AA tests allow you to detect is how much more concentrated you are when you can do that. And if you take all these differences and you rank them properly, you can run the key thing when you're trying to understand an experiment, the key curve that you want to ask, which is a power analysis curve. So let's say that you've decided that a 3% difference was big enough. And you say, if I see a 3% difference in the positive direction for the conversion rate, then I will consider my test to be valid. If you have a test that has no impact, we've decided by construction to say that you have a 5% chance to see any kind of your test to see a difference of more than 3%. And so you have a 5% chance of saying this test is effective. So if you have no difference, that's what the zero is here, you will see 5% of your test saying this is a positive difference. That is not necessarily good, but that's the compromise you have to make to have a certain sensitivity. But if you have 1-2% improvement in conversion rate, 4-5-6% improvement in conversion rate, the probability that you will say, I see a meaningful difference, the impact I have is outside of the expected, the bounds I have, then that curve will go up and up and up until you reach a point where you're fairly confident that this makes sense. And the minimal detectable effect is somewhere on that curve where you decide, I want to have an 80% confident chance that if I see a difference, if there's a difference, I want to see it. That, in this case, would be about 3.5%. In this curve, it will be set up like this one. If you improve the conversion rate by 3.5%, 80% of the time, you will be able to detect that difference with that test setup. That's why when people talk about the test and they try to argue around the circumstance of the test and the sensitivity of the test, what you really want to have is this curve, because this curve tells you that you have a 5%. That's the false positive rate that you've set as 5% by your construction, and how much difference it makes sense. And if you want to say, I want to change that 5% to something else, I want to have a test that is more sensitive, less sensitive, I want to see the impact of having more people part of the test, i.e. running the test for longer, that will move the shape of that curve. And that will tell you how sensitive is your test, whether or not what you're trying to do makes sense. That is the curve that tells you everything. And what I'm trying to do today is to build that curve without using any subtlety around statistics. That is something that you can build looking at past data and randomly assigning them to control and treatments 1,000 times over. You've seen those power curve. You've seen how having users can actually influence it. What do you think would be the most impactful way to improve the power of the test? To improve the power of the test, what you want to have is that curve to be steeper. So the real answer for all these is, don't believe me. Run the test yourself, because you have a lot of nuance for those things. That makes more sense if you actually pick the data for your company and see how things work. Look at the past 6 weeks, 6 months of data you have, and apply this AA formula, this AA approach. Run the AA tests 1,000 times with the randomness and see what the power curve looks like. I'm going to look at the result. But in most cases, if you have more users enroll by running tests for longer, the first answer, you will have a more sensitive test. That is because of some statistical properties that are generally true. It's not always true, but that tends to be true. If you have the same user pool, but you give users a longer time to convert, that rarely has any kind of meaningful impact, but it can impact it positively because the sensitivity of this curve grows a bit if you go from having very rare events, like 5% conversion rate, to 50% conversion rate. There's a small effect there that is quite relevant. So running it for longer might actually have some positive effect, but it's typically a lot weaker than the first effect. So I would say the first one's definitely true. The second one, kind of, but a lot less effective. That's the third answer, longer time to convert. More users not impacted by the change. That, I think, is the most important aspect of running out an A/B test properly, is thinking who is affected by my change. I've seen A/B tests run on what happens if your customer service fails and everybody's assigned to control treatment when they order something. What happens in those tests is that for 95% of people, if you have a good service, they will never see a failure, so they will never trigger whatever your test is supposed to change. So for those users, being part of control and treatment doesn't actually mean anything to them. And that adds a lot of noise. This is what I talk about later as irrelevant traffic. And that is something that is extremely common. My recommendation, if you want to run an A/B test and that it affects something that is quite rare, or something that not everybody will see, is to specifically run the A/B test for those people. To actually see if you try to have a different way of answering the phone for customer service people, only run the test on people who actually run the customer service. It might be a bit more difficult to implement with in-house solutions or things that are less properly implemented. That's why we recommend using Split, because we definitely have a solution for that works fine. But try to limit the impact. That is, once again, something that you can test and actually have a tab on the spreadsheet simulation I have to explain what would be the impact of a test like that. The minimal detectable effect is something that you will hear a lot. This is what I showed on this blobby curve. That's where do we think at tails? What do you think the 5% we ignore on either side? And if you have more users, you can hopefully be able to, if you run the test for longer and you have more users, because you run the test for longer, that minimal detectable effect should be shrunk because you have a more sensitive test. The reason to run a test that way, the reason we care so much about minimal detectable effect, is because the point of running a test is to minimize the damage. If you try to reduce one is worse than the other, what you want to do is run the worst option for as little time as possible. You always test. Whether you control for the test, whether you actually do the right thing is not relevant. You always test. And you want to control because you're always exposing people to a suboptimal experience if you try to run multiple approach. If you try to do any kind of change, you don't know if that change is the proper one. When you do it, you need to run tests for a certain amount of time. The framework of an A/B testing, the framework of defining what is a power test, what is a minimal detectable effect, is heavily dependent on trying to measure that difference, trying to measure the damage, trying to measure how much worse is one option, and minimizing that as much as you can. So when you hear, oh, they're testing something, that means that they're hurting half of the population. That's exactly the opposite of what a test is trying to do. We're not trying to show half. We don't know which one is the best. We want to measure it. And as soon as we measure it, we stop the test. That has an asymmetric effect, and that feels frustrating to reduce that damage for only exactly the moment where that damage was a problem. And so the effort is precisely to minimize that to the least that is necessary to prove that there's a difference. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is why, if we can make all this simulation without the help of statistics, without the help of Greek letters, without all this, we can just take the last data we had, run it through many AA tests, many full splits, and have the kind of insights that we need to decide to run a test. The approach I took, which is to split, is called bootstrapping, as in you just to create samples that you care about. That is a really good illustration technique. It's quite wasteful in terms of computer resources, even if these days it's not as important. And that bootstrapping approach is a good tutorial tool, but it's not very efficient. If you have more than 30 events, statistics have properties that really make sense. So if what you're trying to measure is not rare enough, you can use standard statistics quite helpfully, and they will tell you resource for tests, so you don't need to run the kind of program. So statistics are just a shortcut for all what I've just showed you. Hopefully we've covered like the bulk of what A/B testing is supposed to do. One thing I wanted to ask you is what happens if recently you had a major change? Would you be able to use that data to run a test? I can't tell you what happens in every single case. If you have a little bit more that have benefited from the change or not benefited from the change before and after the change, that generates a bit of noise, and that means that the bell curve that you see is a bit fatter than you would have. So you have more cases where the noise that you measure when you should measure noise is wider. Sometimes, if the change is really dramatic, if you have a small sample, it increases the noise so much that your test is much harder to run, but that is actually fairly rare. I'd be surprised if that were the case if you have a B2C commerce situation. If you're a B2B commerce, that is something where you have, because you have fewer business clients, that's less the case. A lot of you think that you have to restart the test from that point on. That is generally not true. It is true if your test and the change that was made are closely linked. So one example is if you remove a button and you're testing what should be the text on that button, then your test doesn't make sense anymore. And so that's the case where, like, yeah, you have to restart from scratch, or you have to stop doing the test if that doesn't match. But in most cases where you expect to have change have a big influence, it has a small influence. And because you split the two things quite evenly, there's a bit of noise, but not enough for it to affect the result of the test meaningfully. You might have to run the test a little longer, but typically having a major change to your website is something that you can run an A/B test through. But once again, simulate the result with an AA test, see what the impact is, and see if the noise that you get is dramatically different. I just want to have one small point on the kind of nuances that you might want to have. What if, rather than say, oh, I've had people who converted, I had people who bought something, you cared about how much is spent? what is the amount that is spent? Or if you have delay in your API backend, sometimes they fail. How long do they fail? How long until you get the result back? So what you're trying to test is not just an amount. It's not just a yes or no question, it's an amount. Let's see if I can share the tab for that one. So you have exactly the same kind of a pattern that we had until now. You have a timestamp, you have user ID, you have a conversion. And when the conversion is true, when you have an effect, I've assigned a quantity. I've used like a random distribution, and I've purposely picked a distribution that was a bit skewed, that had some very high numbers and a lot of small numbers. You have a lot of numbers under 100. We have some numbers that are really high, like 5,000, 1,000, 2,000, things like that. I have this number with enormous. And same thing, I randomly pick people to be within control or treatments. So this is the overall result. For people that have not converted, I have no amount because they haven't spent anything by not converting. For people that have converted, I have an average amount. I have how many people have converted, and have a standard deviation. As you can tell, standard deviation is really high in those cases. Standard deviation is higher than the control. That is because a lot of times, wait time for service to restore the function, price, anything like that tends to have those properties of being very skewed to the left. If you take those numbers, so here you see what is the average, should not be measured that way. The average is the average, and these are the two average measures, and you make the ratio. So that is how much control is better than treatment. This is treatment has 5,000, control has 3,000. If you pick one of those, then you have a massive difference between control and treatment. In that case, the way I've generated the data, intentionally, there is no difference between control and treatment. I just randomly assign people to one or the other. And I can do the same operation as you've seen done before, which is pick two values and randomly take the measurement and randomly, and you can see what's happening is that the numbers are massively different between the two. It doesn't look great. And in those cases, what I wanted to do. As you can see, when you try to copy those values, the impact is absolutely dramatic. There's no, anytime you change anything, the ratio between control and treatment in the average goes completely out of whack. In that case, because you have a sample of 1,000 users, and because only 30% of them convert, and because those who convert, many of them have a very small amount that they share, but some of them have a massive amount. Whenever that has one of those large is assigned either to treatment or to control, it has an enormous effect on your experiment. And if you wanted to run the same kind of analysis that we did for the previous one, trying to do a bell curve, that bell curve would be completely unlegible because the difference between this average and this average is changing all the time. Anytime I delete something, you see it just goes from one word's 5 times higher than the other, and the other one's 5 times bigger than the other. There's no amount of difference between the two things that is going to make those two things comparable in an easy way, consistently across many repetition. In that case, I would say an A/B test is not going to work. Either what you're measuring, you have to control for the skew, you have to control for how much difference it is, or you need a much larger sample than 1,000 units. This is a case where if I see those data, I'd be like, I don't think an A/B test run the normal way is going to answer your question. You definitely want to think about how to run that slightly differently, either with a different metric or with an approach that is not based on the average of your conversion rate, or you want to run the test on a lot more than 1,000 users. My recommendation in that case would be take the numbers that you care about and see if you run the test for longer. Those two numbers would get somewhere closer to each other, so that when you measure the difference between the two, you have something that's a bit more consistent, that is closer to zero. And that region is somewhere where you can say, if I see a difference of that much, I don't think there's a meaningful A/B test. And I don't think there's a meaningful difference, so I know that is not a significant A/B test. And if I see a big difference, I would know that what I've did was meaningful. That is where an A/B test is useful, is to tell you this data set is not good enough. This data set is going to be problematic for sharing. And last thing, I won't go through more details. If the change only applied to some cases, in that case, having some users that may or may not convert, that may or may not be happy, but that are not actually influenced by a test, is going to induce a lot of noise. So we definitely tell you to be mindful about that one. Same thing. So there's a simulation about it. And so what I would think is essential is for you to pay attention to that and not try to influence this too much. My question for David is, do you know if there's any question that you want me answered in the from participants?
Absolutely, yeah. We do have some great questions coming in from the audience here. While we take those questions, Bertel, I think it'd probably be good just to bring up this poll. Here we go. What do you want us to talk about next in our upcoming webinars? We want to get your feedback. What topics would be most important to you out there in the audience? So yes, first question here that came in, I see Ned is asking about guardrail metrics and its importance, and how does it work with A/B testing?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So Ned, in the quiz, the question that you see in front of you, that's the first option, is testing with more than one metric, or something known as the overall evaluation criteria. So far, I've taken as a token example, you change something because you want to improve one metric. That is the easiest way to present a test, and that's what makes sense. When most of the changes you're trying to do influence more than just one effect on your website, it's very difficult to have one metric that is good for everybody. A very obvious example for a lot of e-commerce website is you can either improve the conversion or the price or the profitability of your process, or you can improve the customer satisfaction. Being very generous in how you repay people, spending a lot of money on customer service. All these things are valuable. And there's a lot of tests that are like trying to improve that, but they hurt profitability because spending money on those things will not help your bottom line directly. But it makes customers happier and it makes them more likely to come back later. So you have a lot of cases where you want to test on more than one dimension. My recommendation in those cases is always have those guardrail metrics. Know that what change you're doing is not going to hurt some of them dramatically. I've run a test a while ago. I was working for a company, I was renting cars, and it's really complicated to rent cars in a different country than yours because you have a lot of documents, credit card versus debit card. There's like the legalese is inexplicably complicated in many cases. And we thought if we reduce that, people are going to be happy. And they were very much more likely to convert, but they still had to understand a lot of things. If they showed up at the desk, there were some aspects that were not dealt with properly. And in those cases, they were very, very frustrated because they couldn't get the car because we didn't tell them, please bring 2 pieces of ID, because that was part of the model that we made simpler. And customer service immediately told us, this is unacceptable, don't do that. We learned that way that whenever we run a test, we need to include those into the metrics that we care about, because if we don't, we're going to make horrible mistakes and not know about it. So absolutely include those. However, in many cases, the changes that you're applying won't influence those as much as you would like. Because as I tried to show you, a lot of times, A/B tests has a lot of noise. And if the change you're doing on customer service is not dramatic, if your sensitivity of your test is not great, if you cannot detect a change of 2% or 10% on how much people call customer service, you won't be able, because those are rare, you won't be able to measure the effect on your test. So you're going to have, it looks like you increase call to customer service by 10%. That could be a fluke, that could be insignificant, but our test is not able to tell you that. And increasing 10% of call to customer service is enormous. So I would have guardrail metrics. I would definitely expect them to be significant if there's a real problem with it. What you're doing is really positive, but in many cases they're not, even if the effect is actually negative. So what I would try to do is think about those outside of just having guardrail metrics. Don't say, oh, there's guardrail, so if what we do is negative, we'll hear about it through those guardrail metrics. Absolutely have a review and ask your stakeholders, what do they think about the test? If they think it's going to be negative and they're quite convinced about it, try to ask them by how much. And you have statistical technique to say it might have an impact, but it's not as bad as you think. We cannot say it's null, but it's not as much as you think. That you can reach significance a bit faster than trying to prove that there's any effect at all. That's typically a lot of the problems I had is like, there seems to be an effect, but it's not big enough for us to care, is what most tests end up doing. A lot of them are not significant. And so I wouldn't count on a test being significant for you to say there's no problem. That's where overall evaluation criteria, guardrail metrics have some limits.
Okay, excellent. Well, let me share the results of this poll, and it looks like 36% said a more experimentation, talking about experimentation practices, training, workshops, celebration, and documents, followed by testing on difficult metrics, engagement, awareness, and retention. What do you think, Bertel?
Absolutely. I think that's a direction that overall at Split we're taking. The last conference was flagship was last week. We're very focused around this idea of developing practices, which is A/B testing is a principle, it's a tool, it's a very powerful tool, but like every idea, version control in software or CI/CD, those ideas are not just in abstract. They have to have certain processes. They have to have certain rituals. They have to have certain patterns for people to understand how they work properly. And one thing, for instance, that is really important is not just to tell people you must do A/B test, is to help them understand what they're trying to achieve with those A/B tests, how to run them properly, and answer some of the questions. A lot of people have very legitimate questions around, I have a test, I don't know if I'm running it properly, but you want me to run it. So do I run a suboptimal test now and learn after the fact that I wasn't configured properly? So you want to have, before you run workshops, to help people understand how tests work. And if they're doing something obvious, I've had countless cases of the test was a really good idea, but the metric was not the right one. Or the test made sense, but only in some cases. And people didn't think about all the users. And having designers, software engineers, statisticians, look at a test before you run it is really valuable. So this is a really good example of a practice that not everybody runs, but is really, really helpful. Run something like have a review of the test before as an option for people who are less confident. Another practice that I would strongly encourage people to do is to have quite public meetings. We have senior executives around, here's the result of the test. What should we do? The reason for that is if it's a terrible idea, that gives the executive who defended the idea the opportunity to say, thank you so much for telling me I was wrong, because that attitude is super important in experimentation. Have ideas that are justified and make sense, but if the idea doesn't prove to be effective, then that is something that you need to acknowledge publicly. And having executives do that is a really good example. Same thing. Spent a lot of time trying to do something. They had multiple iterations of the same idea because it wasn't as successful the first times, and they end up having something that is really impactful for the company. Have senior executives tell them, thank you so much in front of everybody, and have them tell how this is how you can get something effective is by trying multiple times, by going through the process of a testing. Those two things, celebrating success and having a negative result be acknowledged by people who defended it, is really constructive for a lot of the situation. But where I think the executive are the most valuable is around those overall evaluation criteria, guardrail metrics, or things like that. What if your tests increase conversion rates, increase profitability, but lowers customer satisfaction? Is this something that you want to push forward? That depends on the company values. If you're a company that's like, we're just going to get those customer back with advertising, we don't have any kind of competition, so we don't think this is a customer problem for us, you might want to move forward. If you're a company that is customer first, customer before anything else, a bit like Amazon, for instance, will kind of know what is the answer for that question, giving the executive the ability to say it in public, look at the results and say, in that case, given how much positive and how much negative I'm seeing in that test, I don't want to move forward. That is really helpful because it's not just here are our company values, it's here's what we do about it. And it gives everybody expectations and how it makes sense. So these are two examples of a lot of rituals and practices that I think are really important around experimentation practices, things that you want to reproduce, things that you want to know about. It's not one way for everybody, but I think for a lot of companies, having ideas of how other companies do it is really, really valuable. And hopefully we can talk about that next time.
Absolutely.
Any other
Yeah.
questions?
Yeah, I do want to call the attention of the audience to the poll that's on the screen. What additional information would you like about the split solution that you learned about today? We do want to get your feedback on that. And while you answer that, maybe one final question for you, Bertel. I know we've reached the top of the hour, so maybe just quickly, what should folks do if they want to get started with A/B testing? They want to get started with Split. What do you recommend?
So Split is free for. So if you want to use the feature flag, it's free, so feel free to use it. It is a paying solution if you want to implement experimentation, but please reach out to us if you are trying to understand how experimentation works. My recommendation is try to do it yourself the first time. I know we're supposed to automate that process, but go through the weeds yourself so that you understand the math detail. That is why I've shared a simulation of like the math of, is that actually a significant difference? How does that work? Because that will give you an appreciation for the values. And once you've done that, then the dashboard will make a lot more sense. But more importantly, reach out to people around you who understand experimentation and ask them to walk you through the process. People are very keen to walk you through what is a bit counterintuitive, but absolutely essential process in modern business practices.
Excellent. Yeah, and I do want to call everyone's attention as well to the handouts tab. There's a link right there on the top to book a demo, and you can see Split for yourself and get all your questions answered in that demo process. There's also a number of links there, a blog post on why experiment at all, an interview here with Bertel on A/B testing by cluster, and also a simulated bootstrapped AA testing over on the Twitch blog. So some great resources there. If you haven't answered the poll, now's the time to do it. Bertel, thank you so much for the excellent presentation, the really cool demos. I learned a lot. I know the audience did as well. So thank you so much.
My pleasure, David. Talk to you very soon.
And thank you to the folks over at Split for supporting the event today. We're thankful for their support. If you'd like to learn more about A/B testing and the Split solution, again, book a demo right there, as well as respond to the poll. We do want to get your feedback on that. And I'll leave that up while I announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card door prize. This is going out to Barbara Judd from Missouri. Congratulations, Barbara Judd from Missouri. And I'm afraid we had 23 questions we didn't have time to get to in our live session today. We will be routing those to the Split team, and those folks are entered into our best question drawing as well. So thank you, everyone, on the webinar today. I hope that you learned a lot, and have a great day. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.